All right, y'all. Today we're going to talk about evolution. This is chapter 13. This picture shows the evolution of the Stormtrooper helmet in the Star Wars universe, and I just chose this as the background because I love Star Wars. But before we start, I want to say a couple of things. So first, the purpose of this lecture is not to convince you that evolution is fact. Everyone has their own beliefs, and that's fine. And if you don't think evolution is fact, that's your right, and that's your business. But you do need to learn about evolution for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a very important part of biology, and this is a biology class. And secondly, a lot of people do agree with evolution, and it's important to understand what other people think if you want to have a good discussion with them. The more you understand, the more informed you are, the better conversations you can have with other people. I also want to say that evolution and religion or belief in a higher power are not incompatible. Evolution is just a mechanism of change. It's not unreasonable to believe that whatever force designed or created the universe may have used evolution as a tool to create the diversity of life we see today. A common misconception is that evolution completely goes against the existence of God or intelligent design or anything of that nature, and this isn't true. The theory of evolution simply proposes an explanation for how the diversity of life we see today came about. And it's true that this mechanism proposed by evolution could occur without the existence of a higher power. It could possibly have happened without a God, but it could also happen with a God. And the theory of evolution doesn't address God at all. All right, so for those of you who like to have vocabulary lists, I've made a little asterisk next to each vocabulary word, and you can go through and make a list for yourself. I am not going to provide a list for you for two reasons. First of all, if you go back through the lecture and look at everything and have to dig through and find the vocabulary words, you'll have to be reviewing at the same time. And well, yeah, that's the only reason, one reason. All right, let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. In the 1830s, the country of England planned an expedition to explore and to describe areas around the world, and Darwin was hired on as the team's naturalist. So his job was to explore and describe everything he observed about the environment in each place. He was only 22 at the time, and the ship they sailed on was called the Beagle. And he wrote about this journey in his book called The Voyage of the Beagle, which he didn't actually publish until 3 years after the ship returned to England. They left Plymouth up here in England in 1831, and they planned to be gone about 3 years, but the expedition ended up taking 5 years. Darwin is most well known for his work in the Galapagos Islands, which are here off the coast of Ecuador, but they stopped at a lot of places as they circled the globe, and these are just a few of the many stops they made along the way. Darwin did not like the Galapagos. I was able to go there a few years ago, and I thought it was the most magical place I had ever been, without a doubt. But Darwin made no secret of his hatred in his journal. This is a marine iguana. These guys are incredible. They are nimble on land, they blend in perfectly with the lava rock, and they can also swim. And when they swim, they just fold up their arms and their legs against their body, and they just swim along like a fish. But Darwin hated them. He drew this picture, and he wrote that it is a hideous creature of a dirty black color, stupid and sluggish in its movements. Well, tell us how you really feel. Go ahead and watch this little video clip if you want to. It's just super funny. Uh, you don't have to watch it. He also hated the plants. We fancied even that the bushes smelt unpleasantly. Although I diligently tried to collect as many plants as possible, I succeeded in getting very few, and such wretched-looking little weeds would have better become an Arctic than an equatorial flora. All the plants have a wretched, weedy appearance, and I did not see one beautiful flower. Gosh, okay. He really did love Tahiti, though. He says, I was pleased with nothing so much as with the inhabitants. The common people, when working, keep the upper part of their bodies quite naked, and it is then that the Tahitians are seen to advantage. They are very tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, and well proportioned. Many of the men are tattooed, and the ornaments follow the curvature of the body so gracefully that they have a very elegant effect. I thought the body of a man thus ornamented was like the trunk of a noble tree embraced by a delicate creeper. Ugh. All right. He did not like the ladies so much. He says, I was much disappointed in the personal appearance of the women. They are far inferior in every respect to the men. All right, then. So back to the theory of evolution. Darwin made a lot of observations during his time in the Galapagos, and that obviously because was his job as the ship's naturalist. He collected a lot of specimens, he brought them back to England with him, and he was really struck by something he noticed about the finches. There were a lot of these finches, but they all used different things as their main food source. Some of them ate cactus, some ate seeds, some ate insects, and he noticed that the main difference in these birds was the shape of their beaks. The structure of the beaks correlated with their function, that is, which food they ate. He wrote in his journal, the most curious fact is the perfect gradation in the size of the beaks in the different species of Geospiza. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. This diagram here shows how a finch's beak shape relates to the beak function. And you can see that birds that eat cactus parts, they have these big, strong beaks right there, or crushing through tough cactus seeds. And then there's another bird that eats cactus seeds and parts, but it has a narrower beak to get into the crevices of the cacti. And these finches that eat mainly seeds all seem to have pretty short, strong beaks here. Where was I? Oh, yes, good for cracking the seeds open. And the birds that eat mainly insects have these nice, long, thin, pointy beaks to dig the insects out of small places. But then they also might have these big, crushing beaks to crush the exoskeletons. So the thing about the Galapagos Islands is that it's a collection of several islands. It's 600 miles away from the mainland of South America, and the islands are volcanic. So in the beginning, they were made entirely of hardened rock, hardened lava rock. So just try and imagine how these dead black rock islands came to support so much life, because any animal that lives there would have had to have flown at least 600 miles and happened to end up finding this land instead of going out into the ocean forever. Or it would have had to float there, being carried by the ocean current, again, right to these small spots of land in the middle of the huge ocean. And any plants there would have had to either come from seeds that were blown on the wind, or from the droppings and poop of animals who carried the seeds with them in their digestive system. So it's not far-fetched to think that at first there were only a few different kinds of birds on the island, maybe even one kind of bird. And on this image, it's represented by the ancestral seed-eating ground finch. And as we all know, when an animal has offspring, none of the offspring are identical. They're all different in some way. So it makes sense that the offspring of this original finch might have had slightly differently shaped beaks. Let's say that the main source of food back then was seeds. It says eating ground finch. The offspring with the strong beaks could crack the seeds and would be more likely to get food and to survive than, say, another offspring with a thinner beak. Or perhaps the one with a thinner beak would have to find something else that it could eat more easily, like maybe insects. So the idea is that from one original finch, as that bird had babies and those babies grew up and had babies, over time this diverse array of beak shapes developed. This process is called adaptive radiation, which means that the population tends to become more diverse when there are a lot of different resources to be used. And in this case, the finches have diversified so much that they're not all competing for the same food source. There's a lot of food to be had on these islands, so why should they all eat the same thing? In adaptive radiation, the population adapts to its environment, and as it adapts, new species, quote unquote, radiate out from the original ancestor, as you can see in the picture. Adaptive radiation. Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. Oh, also these are pictures that I took of the birds all over the place. Anyway, Darwin came up with this theory later, back in London, not on the islands, not even on the journey, although he did do a lot of thinking at that time. Unfortunately, he did not label his bird specimens very well. That made things difficult for him back in London. The perks of being organized. All right, today we're going to talk about these three things. First of all, what is evolution? Second, how it happens. And third, we're going to discuss some evidence for evolution. So first, let's talk about what is evolution. Based on your current knowledge, what would you say evolution is? And if someone asked you to define it, basically, what would you say? And at this point, if we were in the classroom, we'd be getting a lot of different answers that have similar components. Common answers include one animal becoming another, or animals changing, or natural selection. And while none of those answers correctly describe evolution, they all share a theme of change, and that theme is central to evolution. Even in the book, we're going to get different definitions. On page 261, we see this. Evolution is the idea that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present-day ones. And then in the glossary, we see this. Descent with modification. The idea that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present-day ones. Also, the genetic changes in a population from generation to generation. Both of these revolve around a theme of change, but there's no one definition. Evolution is a process. It's described, it's not defined. And here are a few ways to describe it. The overall overarching theme of all evolution is organisms changing and adapting to their environment. Another common description you'll hear is that evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a gene pool over time. This change of alleles, of gene variations, that's called microevolution because we're talking about change on a small scale, and micro means small. This is as opposed to the development of new species, called speciation. Most of the time when people think of evolution, this is what they're thinking about. Chickens developed from dinosaurs and humans developed from monkeys, that kind of thing. This development of new species is also called macroevolution because we're talking about change on a large scale, and macro means large. Eventually, as enough small scale changes occur, as enough microevolution occurs, we will start to see changes on a larger scale. A population of individuals changes over time, and eventually all those changes will begin to build up over many generations until finally the present individual is different enough from the original individual that we call it a new species. And this is why we say that macroevolution is the sum of microevolution, because as the individuals change, the population changes. Let's talk a little bit about what evolution is not. It is not a theory about the origin of life. It only describes what happens to life. It is not the same thing as natural selection. Natural selection leads to evolution. In other words, evolution is driven by natural selection. Evolution is not one animal becoming or turning into another kind of animal. Chimpanzee will not turn into a human during its lifetime. It will always be a chimpanzee, and a chimpanzee will never give birth to a human. Instead, evolution is based partially around the fact that all living things have offspring that are different from themselves and from one another. Let's see. Let's think of it as a family tree. This diagram shows that your great-grandfather had your grandfather, who had your father, who had you. And this information is correct, but it's not a family tree. It's just a line. This is more like it. Each intersection between lines, each corner, that represents a common ancestor. So if we start down here with your great-grandparents, they had children, but only one of these children is your grandparent. The rest of the children, they do share a common ancestor. They're called your great aunts and your great uncles. So your grandparents gave birth to children. Only one of those children became your parent. The rest of them are your aunts and uncles. So both your parents and your aunts and uncles share a common ancestor, which is the grandparents. But they also have a more distant common ancestor, which is the great-grandparents. The most recent common ancestor is the grandparents. And your parents, of course, gave birth to you and to your siblings. So your siblings share a common ancestor with you, which is your parents. And you see you're still related to your aunts and uncles, you're still related to your great aunts and uncles, but not as directly as you are related to your own parents or your own siblings, because you guys share a more recent common ancestor than you do with you and your second cousins or great aunts and uncles or whatever over there. There's one more thing I want you to notice about this diagram, which is that it's ordered based on time. The oldest events are on the bottom and the most recent events are on the top. So in the same way, this diagram does not show evolution. It's much too simple. A fish did not give birth to a salamander, which did not give birth to a cat, which did not give birth to you. That is ridiculous. This is a much more accurate representation of evolution. It's obviously still very simplified, but it does demonstrate the main points that I'm trying to make. This kind of diagram with one central diagonal line and other lines branching off of it, that's called a cladogram. And again, the events progress from bottom to top, with the older events being at the bottom and the most recent events being at the top. Let's start at the bottom. Each intersection between the lines, remember, represents a common ancestor. The oldest organism represented on this tree is the common ancestor of all vertebrates. So everything that descended from this guy here has a backbone, and that means everything else on the diagram. The common ancestor had some offspring who had other offspring, and so on and so forth. All the offspring were different, and after many generations, some of these descendants are now known as fish. Others, not so much. After a lot of time, many mutations, some of those offspring eventually had 4 legs. So this is the most recent ancestor of everything that has a backbone, that is a vertebrate, and has 4 legs. Everything from this point on in the diagram has 4 legs and a backbone. So this guy had some offspring, who had more offspring, who had more offspring, and all the offspring were different. And some of those descendants are now known as amphibians. Others, not so much. Over time, after many mutations, some of these offspring eventually had fur. They gave birth to live young, they produced milk, and they're endotherms, or quote-unquote warm-blooded. And these guys we call mammals. So everything from this point out is mammals. Here's some vocabulary for you. It's most recent common ancestor, which is abbreviated MERCA. The most recent common ancestor of all the mammals is right here. And, oh, damn it, I'm so sorry. The most recent common ancestor of all the vertebrates is here. The most recent common ancestor of all the 4-legged vertebrates is here. It's really common to think that evolution has progressed from simpler organisms to more advanced organisms, and that the human being is like the pinnacle of evolution. And most diagrams of evolution show the human as the most recent example, which means that it's either going to be at the top of the diagram or the right of the diagram or both. And so that encourages the assumption that humans is the most advanced species. The major flaw in this reasoning is that it assumes that currently living species are the primitive forms of life, from which the more advanced species descended. However, all living species are descended from a most recent common ancestor, and they're all equally related to that ancestor. Our species, Homo sapiens, is certainly one of the most complex species. It's not more advanced or better or anything like that. People do throw around the word advanced. And when people say that, they're just talking about evolution, and what they truly mean is complex. When we say that amphibians are more advanced than fish, in reality, they're just more complex than fish. I'm going to briefly go back to the example of a family tree. So you are here at the present day, and everyone else is behind you. But take a look at your siblings. You're not more advanced than they are, although in some cases you may like to think so. You and your siblings simply descended from a most recent common ancestor, which is right here, your parents, to whom you are both equally related. Let's take a look at the great aunts and the great uncles. You're not more advanced than them. It's just that the two of you share a most recent common ancestor, which is the great grandparents, this group right here. And look, we could even switch you around with your siblings group and put you here and put your siblings here. And even though you're not on the right anymore, the diagram is still accurate. So instead of thinking of a species as more primitive or more advanced, we have to think of all the species as sort of a set of nested hierarchies. And I'm going to go back up to this slide. If you were to switch around this mammal and the human and put the human over here and put the mammal over here, that doesn't make the human any less advanced or primitive than the other mammal. It just means that they're in different places. Diagram. All right. Here's a couple of cladograms. I just wanted you to see how complex evolution actually is. The diagram on the left is very simplified, and the diagram on the right is more realistic. You can see that there's interactions between the groups. Some of them breed with others and then they diverge, and some of them diverge and then breed and interact, and all manner of things over there. Pretty complex. Remember, natural selection is not evolution. Based on his observations, Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection is what keeps pushing evolution to happen. The theory of evolution by natural selection has four main components. The first is overproduction, meaning that more offspring are produced than can survive. The second is genetic variation, meaning that within a population, different individuals have different traits. And keep in mind that Darwin didn't know about DNA and mutations. He only knew what he observed at the time, which is that different individuals have different traits. Third part is the struggle to survive, or competition. Individuals within a population compete for resources to survive, and certain individuals have a genetic advantage over others. And then the last element of the theory is called differential reproduction, meaning the individuals that survive are the ones that reproduce and pass their advantageous characteristics to the offspring. So these characteristics become more common in a population over time. Here's an example of this theory. Scientists have found fossils of giraffes with shorter necks than modern day giraffes. So the question was, well, why does the giraffe we have today have a long neck? Well, we look at the giraffes of today and we see that the main benefit of their long neck allows them to eat leaves off of trees. Here's the reasoning. First, there was a spontaneous/accidental genetic change, a mutation in the DNA that gave one giraffe a longer neck than the rest of the giraffes in the population. And this mutation would most likely have been in the sperm or the egg that joined to form this baby giraffe. So even if it was growing in the womb, it had this new gene for a longer neck. There are a lot of mutations that happen, but this is the only one, this long neck one, is relevant to this example. So that's the mutation I'm going to talk about. And remember that not all mutations are bad things, and mutations happen randomly. Just because the giraffes needed long necks to get food doesn't mean they told their DNA and the DNA said, okay, let's mutate to give this guy a longer neck. It did not happen that way. So when the giraffe had babies, they inherited the gene for a long neck. So if we put this in terms of the theory of evolution by natural selection, here's what we would get. We assume that there were too many giraffes for the food that was available. That's overproduction. Because the giraffes are all different, some of them have longer necks, and that's genetic variation. The giraffes competed for food, and the ones with longer necks who were able to eat the food, those ones survived and reproduced and passed their genes on to the next generation. That's differential reproduction, competition and differential. All right, let's define how evolution happens. Let's see. Yes. A lot of people like to say that evolution happens on the level of populations and not individuals. They say that populations evolve, but individuals do not. And this is true because they're talking about what we call macroevolution. There's also microevolution, which is a change in allele frequencies in a gene pool over time. Speciation is the development of new species. That's macroevolution. And macroevolution is essentially some of microevolution. A misconception is that evolution takes millions of years. It can actually be observed. And we will talk about a real life example later on. And then pause. All right, moving on. Microevolution is a change in the allele frequency of a gene pool over time. Well, what does that mean? Let's use the allele example of hairy hands. Big H is dominant, and that means your hands will be hairy, and little h is recessive, and that means your hands are going to be smooth. So let's say that there are 12 individuals in this population, and these are their respective genotypes. There's 12 of them. All of these alleles together, all of these genes together, that's called the gene pool of the population. Usually, all alleles are just shuffled and redealt and everything through sexual reproduction. And if microevolution is a change in the allele frequency of a gene pool, then what is allele frequency? That's what we have to answer. And here's what allele frequency is. It's the allele of interest divided by the total alleles in the gene pool. So for big H, let's count those up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that would be 6 divided by the total number of alleles in the gene pool, which is 20. And that comes out to be 0.3. And then for little h, we would count up all the little h's and we would get 14 and divide that by 20. And the frequency comes out to 0.7. As long as these allele frequencies don't change, 0.3 and 0.7, then the population is stable. There's no microevolution, as long as these alleles just stay the same. If there's ever a change in allele frequencies, that means evolution has occurred. There's only 5 things that can cause evolution. So we're going to talk about microevolution now, which is it can change only 5 things that can change the allele frequencies of the population. These are 5 mechanisms of evolution, 5 ways that the allele frequency of a population can change. The first one is small sample size or a small population. This allows evolution because it means that populations are more susceptible to genetic drift, which is a change in the allele frequency due to chance, something that has nothing to do with survival advantages. For example, stepping on beetles. These beetles are just hanging out on the sidewalk, and then some dude comes with his fancy dress shoes and stomps on them. The beetles had nothing to do with that. Some of them were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they were removed from the gene pool. So now the gene pool is different. Small sample size contributes to microevolution because with a smaller gene pool, any change will have a more significant effect on the population as a whole. If there were 1,000 beetles here and some of them got stomped on, it wouldn't have as big of an effect on the overall population as if there's only, like, what is this, 7, 10 beetles. Yeah, that has a bigger effect on the population as a whole. Second is non-random mating. If individuals choose their traits based on specific characteristics, that's not random. And that will change the allele frequency because certain alleles are favored over others. So here's an example of random mating right here. These coral polyps, they hang out on rocks and they just disperse their sperm into the ocean currents. And where the sperm go and when they go and if they find an egg at all, that's completely up to chance. The corals themselves have nothing to do with it. But assortative or non-random mating, the blister beetles right here, they're more likely to mate with partners of the same size. So they are selecting their mates. They're choosing them. An example in humans is eye color. A lot of people like blue eyes. And in the beginning, blue eyes was just one mutation. There was just one person who had it. But as individuals found it attractive, they chose to mate with the people who had blue eyes. And so more children were born who had that allele of blue eye. Moving on, the third thing is mutations. Remember that from DNA, RNA is made, and then from RNA, a protein is made. Keep in mind that Darwin didn't know about DNA and mutations, but now we know what causes people to be different. The original source of all differences in mutations is mutations in different genes. Change in DNA will cause a change in RNA, which will cause a change in protein. And this is the ultimate source of new alleles and new genes. And those change the frequency of alleles in a gene pool. Because if you're adding alleles, then that's going to change the allele frequency. Mutations are the ultimate source of all new genetic information, all new alleles, and all new genes. If you want to, you can watch this little animation talking about mutations. A great example of how microevolution functions on mutations is sickle cell anemia, which is very prevalent in areas that have high malaria rates. It's caused by a mutation of simply just one DNA base, and then that causes a wrong protein, which causes these abnormal red blood cells that look like sickles. And the sickle cells can't carry as much oxygen because they don't have as much room for hemoglobin. However, they also have a reduced ability to carry malaria parasites, and that is important because part of the malaria life cycle involves invading red blood cells, and the sickle cells aren't able to support the parasite. So anyone with sickle cell anemia has a lesser chance of getting malaria. The fourth mechanism of evolution is gene flow, which is as organisms enter and leave the population, the allele frequency changes, which is a flow of genes between populations. So if this bird flies over the river, it's taking its alleles with it, and that's adding new alleles to this population, and suddenly the allele frequency has changed. So we can say at that point that microevolution has occurred. Fifth is natural selection, that organisms that survive are able to pass on their genes. Great example right now is COVID-19. Some people get it and die, some people get it and survive. Natural selection is happening right now. The fittest is not necessarily the one that survives the longest, though. The fittest is the one with the most offspring, the most able to pass on its genes. In terms of evolution, doesn't matter what happens after you have had babies, after you have passed on your genes and your alleles to the next generation. That's the relevant part. So, based on the pictures, which parent bird do you think is the fittest? Pause and figure it out. All right. B is the fittest because it has more offspring. In terms of evolution, the fittest is the one who has the most offspring. You know what I just realized? This totally looks like that awful monster from Stranger Things from the first season, and I guess the second season too. Oh, God, that thing's terrible. All right. Answer this check yourself question, and the answer will be at the end of the presentation. Let's talk a little bit about speciation, which is development of new species. As new alleles are created through mutations, as they're shuffled through sexual reproduction and they're passed to offspring, eventually the allele frequencies will have changed enough. The whole population is different from the original, and there will be enough new alleles that some individuals will be different enough to be considered a new species. But what is different enough? First of all, we define a species as two organisms that belong to the same species if they can and will interbreed, produce viable, fertile offspring. Viable means the offspring can live to the age of sexual maturity, and fertile means they can have offspring of their own. So, are a donkey and a horse the same species? No, they are not. And here's how we know. A mule is the offspring mouse. Mule is the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Is it viable? Can it live to the age of sexual maturity? Yes. Is it fertile? Can it have offspring of its own? No, it is not. And this is actually why. A mule has an uneven number of chromosomes. In order to make sperm and eggs, the number of chromosomes an organism has to divide in half. But a mule has 63 chromosomes. has 3 of chromosome 31. And what's half of 63? Well, 31 and a half, but you can't have half of a chromosome. So the mule's body can't make sperm or eggs, depending on if it's male. If none of these 5 things are happening, the population is not evolving, and it's said to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The original allele frequencies remain constant from generation to generation. In order for a population not to be evolving, in order for it to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, there's 5 conditions that have to be met. First, the population has to be large. Second, there has to be random mating, where individuals randomly select mates. Third, no mutations can occur. Fourth, you can't have any input or loss of alleles through immigration or emigration, people leaving or entering the population. And fifth, neither the dominant allele or the recessive allele offers any survival advantage. This is essentially the exact opposite of the 5 mechanisms of evolution. Go ahead and watch the textbook animation, Mechanisms of Evolution. Just want you to know it's very important that the human species is still evolving. Evolution is an ongoing process. Things don't just stop changing once Homo sapiens arose. For example, since humans have evolved, we have acquired the trait to digest lactose. Possibly the fastest evolutionary change to occur in humans is mutation, allowing humans to live at high altitudes. This has become common in populations in Tibet, Ethiopia, and the Andes Mountains. Mutation has spread through the population within only the last 3,000 years or so. Also, we've acquired the sickle cell gene. That's become prevalent in areas where malaria is present. All right, go back through the lecture, fill in this table, and you should know it. It'll be helpful for you when you review for the final, and it will also be helpful for you on the quiz later on. All right, let's talk about some evidence for evolution. The first point I want to talk about is the fossil record. Fossils, they show how organisms have changed through time in terms of morphology, which is shape and physical appearance. And not all organisms are represented in fossil records, so there are gaps in the fossil record. And really, it's kind of a miracle that we have any fossils at all, because fossils can only form under a very specific set of conditions. Fossils have to form in sedimentary areas. The organism has to die very quickly. It has to be very quickly covered up with the right kind of material to preserve the skeleton. And then all of the right kinds of conditions have to happen for that skeleton to continue to be preserved. Yeah. Here's just an example of some horse, well, they're not all horses, but they are horse-related fossils. So up here at the top, we have the modern day horse. And then you can see as we go back through the fossil record, they have found these different fossils, and you can see how they change throughout time, just gradually, just little changes, but they do change. Second, geographic distribution of related species. This is called biogeography, which is the study of the locations of organisms around the world, that is, their distribution patterns. Closely related animals may have adapted to different environments in nearby regions. Here's a great example of biogeography. So this is back, during the Pangea age, back when the continent was called Gondwana land. And we've got this emu here, just hanging out. We find the emu, the modern day emu, in Australia, and I guess around here as well. There's also a rhea, which is like an emu, and that's in South Africa. And then in South America, we have the ostrich, which is also like an emu. So these things look very similar, and we can infer that at some point, a common ancestor was hanging out around here. And oh my gosh, that country is called Oz. That's awesome. Awesome. Oh my God. Okay. Anyway, so we can infer that at some point in the past, a common ancestor lived around here. And then as the populations diverged, they became different. They evolved differently. Next is anatomy and embryology. Anatomy is the study of the structure of organisms, and embryology is the study of how they develop. We can infer evolutionary relationships by looking at homologous structures, which are similar structures that are found in different species. So we have a human here, we have a cat, a whale, and a bat. All of them have phalanges, which is this part in brown. All of them have a radius and an ulna. I think that's what these bones are anyway. And all of them have this shoulder bone, this upper arm bone up here. And everybody's got the uh, little carpals here. And just notice how they all have similar functions and locations. So a human, we use our hands to grasp things. A bat also uses its little hands to grasp things. The whale and the bat both use their limbs to propel themselves through a certain kind of medium. For the bat, it's air. For the whale, it's water. And then cats and humans, we can both use our hands, quote unquote, to manipulate things and also to walk. We can walk on our hands on all fours. Anyway, so these show that these different organisms are related, and obviously we are more closely related to a cat than we are to a whale or a bat. And you can just see that based on the structure, even though it's pretty obvious to everybody just by looking at us. All right, go ahead and answer the check yourself question. Which skull is most distantly related to the other three? All right, embryology is the study of how organisms develop. Embryos of related organisms most likely develop in similar ways. Here are 4 different organisms at different stages of development. We have a fish here, then we have chicken, we have a pig, and we have a human. And you can see that the development of the pig and the human at different stages are more similar to one another than the development of the human and the chick or the fish. That's super different. You can see that the pig and the chicken are more closely related than the chicken and the human. And you can just tell that. And then we know that these things are fact because of analyzing genetic evidence and seeing how closely identical different genes are to one another in the different organisms. Oh, I also want to address one thing, which is that there's this thing where a long time ago a dude falsified some evidence. He went and he found pictures of different embryos and he kind of tweaked them. And then he was like, well, this embryo shows that it went through these various stages of evolution at different stages in its life. So let's take the well, it must have started out as a worm because it looks like this, and then the worm changed into blah 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 blah. Yeah, that's not true at all. Don't believe that. No. All right, next evidence, antibiotic and pesticide resistance in various organisms. A lot of organisms that are exposed to antibiotics and pesticides over a prolonged period of time become resistant. We have MRSA, which is a strain of bacteria that's resistant to most of the antibiotics ever. Insects can become resistant to pesticides. The potato beetle in Colorado is resistant to the pesticide that it was originally sprayed with. And this is all because of mutations. Mutations, they lead to new genetic information, which is new alleles. Another example would be that in the 1960s, the World Health Organization, the WHO, they launched a campaign to eradicate malaria, and they did this by focusing on killing mosquitoes, which is the vector that transmits malaria. And they just sprayed everything with DDT. And a lot of the mosquitoes died, most of them did, but some of them survived. And those ones had babies that survived. And essentially, DDT resistance evolved in mosquito populations. And so now, yeah, that didn't work. That's really sad, but it didn't. The fifth line of evidence for evolution is DNA and protein analysis. DNAs and proteins are used to analyze relationships between organisms based on similarities in these things. And this provides the most precise information about relationships between organisms. It is the more similar genetic material and proteins are, the more closely related the organisms are, the more recent their common ancestor is. Let's look at an example. Fibroblast, FGF2 is the gene. A fibroblast builds collagen and it helps heal wounds. And I have gone to this website and done a couple of alignments of the FGF2 genes. So this is comparing a human with a tarsier, which is this absolutely freaking adorable little thing that lives in trees and has huge eyes and a tail, and it's adorable. It is a primate. So I went and I aligned the, yes, I agree with it. I went and I aligned the DNA sequences for the FGF2 gene, and this is what I got. The human is on the top, and the tarsier is on the bottom. These ends represent that it could be anything. The red indicates that that's part of the gene that actually codes for the protein, so you don't have to worry about the color difference. But I just want you to see, oh gosh, look at all these. The dashes are where they don't line up. So we have all this identicalness, except some are missing huge blocks. And then we go down here and there's like tons missing. So yeah. Then I went and I aligned the human and the chimpanzee FGF2 genes. And look how similar they are. Crazy. Like, look at that. As opposed to the tarsier. Poor little God. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty intense stuff. And lastly, artificial selection, which is really cool. This occurs when a human breeder chooses individuals to parent the next generation based on desired traits. It's a type of directed evolution, which is evolution manipulated by humans to reach a desired end goal or organism with desired traits. There's so many good examples. The Toiger cat is there's these people that make what they call designer cats, and a designer cat essentially is just a cat that has designer traits. So they've taken cats and they've selected, like, this one sort of moves like a tiger, and this one sort of looks like a tiger, and this one has stripes. And then they just breed them with each other, and they continue to breed and breed and breed until they got a cat that looks like a tiger, and it's called a Toiger. And then they just euthanized the cast-offs. You could buy one for $1,000 back when they were developing the breed, but I think that's I think it's done. Sheep who poop at night. The sheep who poop at night were bred during the early modern period, during the Middle Ages. Farmers didn't want to have to go out and scoop up all the poop in the fields so that they could use it for manure. So what they did was they went and picked the sheep that pooped at night and bred them together, so that when farmers brought the sheep in at night to eat, they would have them stand over a grate, and all the poop would fall down into this pit below the grate, and then the farmers could use it for fertilizer. War horses of the Middle Ages, domestication of foxes. I won't keep going, but this is a cute, well, it's not cute. It's very profound little video. It's about 3 minutes talking about the domestication of foxes. You don't have to watch it, but it's fun. All right, answers to the check yourself questions. Based on the pictures, which parent bird is the fittest? That would be parent B. In an evolutionary sense, an individual organism have high fitness if it reproduces more successfully than other individuals. And the most distantly related skull is skull A. You can tell that by looking at its structure. And that's the end. So go take the quiz. Bye.